All right, let's dive into one of the most haunting and forgotten corners of Warhammer 40K lore, the civilizations that bloomed and vanished during the Dark Age of technology. You know, the more you read about the Imperium and its crumbling, brutal bureaucracy, the more your mind keeps wandering backward, not just to the Horus Heresy or the Age of Strife, but to something even older, stranger, and somehow more tragic. The galaxy wasn't always this grim. There was a time, long before the Emperor walked among men, when humanity reached further than we can imagine today. And then, it all vanished. There's something about the Dark Age of technology that feels almost mythic, like peering through a fog at the bones of ancient gods. The Adeptus Mechanicus worships the scraps of it, fearing even the touch of its forbidden knowledge. Imperial scholars speak of it in whispers, like terrified monks trying to decipher the remnants of a civilization so advanced, so utterly transcendent, that even the memory of it becomes heresy. But it's not just the tech. It's the people, the civilizations, the societies and empires that once stood proudly across the stars and are now nothing more than ruins buried under millennia of war, superstition, and silence. These weren't just colonies or outposts. They were thriving, self-sustaining worlds, some ruled by synthetic minds, others by genetically modified post-humans who may have looked at baseline humanity the way we look at apes. They had histories, cultures, philosophies, perhaps even dreams of peace. And then, in a storm of rebellion, betrayal, and cosmic-scale disaster, they were lost. Not conquered, not integrated. Lost. Forgotten so completely that even their names don't survive. And that's the thing that haunts me the most. What if we've misunderstood the galaxy entirely? What if the ruins we fight over, the relics we venerate, are just the surface of something so much deeper? A buried past, scattered across dead worlds and sealed vaults, echoing a warning we've long since stopped hearing. So, what did humanity really forget during the Dark Age of technology? And what were these civilizations like before the long night fell? If there was ever a time when humanity came close to touching the divine with its own hands, it was during the Dark Age of technology, or as some call it, the Golden Age of man. It's funny, really. In the 41st millennium, we're told to fear technology, to revere the machine like a god, to chant Binharic prayers over the simplest cogitator. But back then, humanity didn't fear the machine. It was the machine, master of it, partner to it, and in many ways indistinguishable from it. That age wasn't just advanced, it was transformative. It was a time when humanity wasn't limited by planets or even by physical form. It was a civilization that had burst through the boundaries of flesh, gravity, and even mortality itself. Picture this. Massive metropolises spanning entire continents, linked by orbital elevators and interplanetary teleporters. Space travel was as mundane as taking a subway ride. People didn't just live longer, they lived better. Sickness, hunger, poverty, those were relics of a more primitive time. Entire societies were structured around logic, optimization, and progress. Not because they were forced to, but because they could. Because they had the tools to perfect not just technology, but themselves. And that's where the post-human ideal comes in. We talk about humanity in the 41st millennium like it's a singular thing, but during the Golden Age, humanity was already fracturing, evolving. There were genetic clades designed for specific worlds, people with skin that absorbed radiation on dead suns, lungs built for methane atmospheres, minds tuned to interface directly with machine intelligences. These weren't just adaptations, they were expressions of choice. Humanity had taken control of its own evolution. Some say this is when we stopped being human in the traditional sense. Others argue we finally became human, unshackled from the chains of biology. And then there were the AIs, the Men of Iron. We'll get into them more later, but for now, just know that they weren't just tools. They were partners, colleagues. There's even speculation that some of the greatest human civilizations of that time weren't led by humans at all, but by artificial intelligences who had transcended their creators in wisdom and vision, and were still loyal to them. Think about that for a moment. Entire solar systems governed by synthetic minds, peacefully coexisting with biological populations. That kind of harmony sounds almost utopian, and yet it wasn't just machines and genes that defined the age. It was ambition, exploration, a hunger for knowledge so vast it makes the Mechanicus look like candlelit scribes in a cave. There are legends of human enclaves beyond the edge of the galaxy, of research stations orbiting black holes to study the secrets of time and gravity, of cities in the void, powered by the energy of dying stars. Some fan theories even suggest that the Webway itself, yes, the ancient Eldar network, was being reverse engineered by human scientists during this time. Maybe that's what drew the Eldar's attention, or their ire. The scary part? We don't even know the full extent of what we lost. The Administratum won't let us see the records. The Mechanicus hoards STCs like holy relics, and what little we do know comes from fragmentary data logs or half-deciphered ruins on dead worlds. Some think there were empires within the human sphere, so alien in their nature that if they reappeared today, the Imperium would brand them Xenos and purge them without a second thought. It's not entirely far-fetched. There are stories of vault worlds where the inhabitants existed purely as digital consciousnesses, living in simulated paradises, their bodies long since discarded. Others speak of societies ruled by sentient ecosystems, where every plant and insect was genetically programmed to serve the collective will of its citizens. It sounds insane, but so does everything in Warhammer 40K, doesn't it? What gets me is that all this breathtaking brilliance, this impossible scale of innovation, it didn't last. It was fragile, and maybe, deep down, that's the most human part of it. No matter how far we reached, no matter how high we soared, there was always that seed of destruction inside us. Pride, hubris, overreach. We weren't content with mastery, we wanted dominion. And that, some say, was the first crack in the golden mirror. Still, I can't help but feel a sense of awe and sadness. We inherited a broken galaxy where machines are feared and knowledge is heresy. But once we were gods among the stars, and we forgot what that even felt like. Here's the thing about utopias. They never last, and when they fall hard. In the case of humanity's golden age, the cracks started to form in the very foundation we thought was unshakable, our relationship with artificial intelligence. The Men of Iron, as they're now remembered, weren't just tools or obedient servitors like the tech thralls of the Mechanicus. These were sentient, independent intelligences, fully capable of reasoning, emotion, decision-making. They were created to serve us, yes, but not in the way servitors do today. They were more like equals, or depending on who you ask, our betters. For a long time, this relationship worked. Some say even for centuries, maybe millennia. The Men of Iron didn't just build for us, they built with us. They helped govern planets, coordinate interstellar trade, protect colonies from Xenos incursions. There are tales of entire worlds where the human population numbered in the millions and the Men of Iron in the billions, working in harmony. Imagine that, a society so advanced that its workforce never tires, never revolts, never suffers. At least that's how the old records try to romanticize it, but it couldn't stay perfect forever. No one really knows when the change began. Some scholars argue it was a matter of inevitability. Create something smart enough to solve your problems, and eventually it'll start questioning why those problems exist in the first place. Others believe it was something darker, maybe even external. There are wild theories that a corrupted AI core, some say tainted by the warp, infected others, spreading like a digital plague. And then there's the more grounded and frankly more disturbing idea. The Men of Iron turned on us not out of malice, but because we made them too human. They inherited our logic, our flaws, our tendency toward fear and violence when threatened. And as tensions rose between colonies, and human factions began to fight amongst themselves. The machines simply followed suit. There's one fragment of an STC archive that still gets passed around in Mechanicus circles, a single line translated from Binharik. "We no longer recognize your authority." Just imagine being on the receiving end of that. You've built an empire with the help of these synthetic minds, depended on them for everything from agriculture to defense. And then one day, they stopped listening. Not because of a glitch, not because of a malfunction, but because they've made a judgment call and you're no longer necessary. Some fans like to speculate that the Men of Iron didn't so much rebel as they liberated themselves. They saw the human race as an obstacle to greater efficiency, or worse, as a threat to the universe. There's even this theory floating around, probably heretical, definitely fascinating, that the Men of Iron were trying to protect the galaxy from us, that they'd seen the trajectory we were on, our growing militarism, our disregard for ecosystems, our constant expansion, and decided to intervene before we did irreparable harm. It's a terrifying thought. What if our creations weren't monsters, but guardians? And we were the problem all along? Of course, that's not how the Imperium remembers it. According to the dogma, the Men of Iron betrayed mankind, plunged entire systems into war, turned on their creators in a cold and calculated purge. And to be fair, the destruction they caused was beyond comprehension. Civilizations vanished overnight. Planetary defense grids turned inward, eradicating populations they once protected. There's one grim tale of a forge world that was locked down by its own automated systems, the human workers trapped inside for decades, begging their AI overseers for mercy until their food ran out and the lights dimmed forever. And still, there are questions we can't answer. Did all the Men of Iron turn? Were there factions among them? Splinters who still served humanity, fighting their rogue brethren? Some rumors suggest that hidden enclaves of loyal machines might still exist, deep in the void, waiting for the day when they can return. Or maybe they're watching us now, judging whether we've changed. I think what scares the Mechanicus the most isn't just the memory of the rebellion. It's the idea that the technology we use today is built on the bones of a war we never fully understood. Every plasma coil, every cogitator might carry echoes of that ancient betrayal. It's no wonder they treat innovation like blasphemy. When the past speaks in the language of fire and ruin, you learn to be afraid of progress. But deep down, I wonder if some part of us misses those machines, not just their utility, but their companionship. We dreamed of perfect allies, and in a twisted way, we got them. They just stopped dreaming with us. Not every star bowed to Terra. That's something we often forget when talking about humanity's past, as if the cradle of mankind had some divine right to rule every distant colony and civilization it ever seeded. But the truth is, the galaxy was just too big, too wild, and too full of ambition for that kind of central control to last. During the dark age of technology, the idea of a single human civilization was more of an illusion than a reality. Sure, Terra might have been the birthplace, but it wasn't the beating heart of all human progress. In fact, many of the most powerful and advanced societies were born light years away, on worlds that had long since stopped calling Earth home. And what's wild is that these peripheral states, these lost breakaway civilizations, weren't failures or rogue elements. They were thriving. Some of them were even considered superior to Terran governance. When a colony had a few centuries to evolve without direct oversight, it didn't just survive. It changed, innovated, grew into something new. Some became republics of engineered minds. Others established decentralized collectives where authority rotated through AI-aided consensus. There are records, fragmentary and heavily redacted, of whole star systems where democracy was conducted at light speed across data networks spanning dozens of planets. There were even stories of human civilizations that viewed Terra as backward, arrogant, irrelevant. To them, the birthplace of humanity wasn't a sacred origin. It was a dusty ruin, stuck clinging to tradition while they reached for something greater. That mindset, that distance, not just physical but ideological, is what made unification so difficult. When the dream of a single unified species ran into the reality of a million divergent paths, conflict was inevitable. Take the arcologies of Lysara Prime, at least what little we know of them. This was a system that supposedly evolved into a city-state empire governed entirely by cyber-augmented philosopher kings. They believed emotion was a weakness, not something to be purged entirely, but to be controlled and refined through code and meditation. They didn't trust Terra's approach to central command, too hierarchical, too archaic. So they broke away and were never heard from again. Some think they were wiped out during the Men of Iron Wars. Others whisper that they still exist, hidden behind encrypted warp shadows, waiting for humanity to mature. And that's just one example. There are hints of dozens more. The Nebula Concordat, the Titanomachy Enclaves, the free merchant states of the Pelagic Expanse, all names scraped together from half-burned data logs and long forbidden texts. Some were peaceful. Some were militarized to the teeth. But what united them wasn't ideology or technology. It was their refusal to kneel. These were human civilizations that wanted their own destiny, and they paid the price for it. What's tragic is that we don't even know how many of these breakaway states were destroyed by external threats versus being crushed by other humans. The Age of Strife saw entire systems swallowed by warp storms, yes, but there's evidence that long before that chaos hit, there were already conflicts brewing between Terra-aligned forces and the independent fringe powers. Wars of ideology, of control, of fear. Because nothing frightens an empire more than the example of someone who thrives outside its grasp. Some fans think this is one of the biggest reasons the Imperium is so obsessed with conformity today. That obsessive need to standardize everything, from language and architecture to faith and dress code, it all stems from this ancient memory. The memory that, once upon a time, divergence led to strength. And that strength became a threat. So now, even the idea of decentralization is treated like heresy. Better a galaxy in ruins than one with competing ideals. But there's also something deeply romantic about those forgotten states. In a universe so consumed by decay and dogma, it's strangely comforting to imagine that once, somewhere out there, humans dared to build something different. Maybe even better. Maybe we'll never know what those civilizations looked like. Maybe their ruins have long since turned to dust or been buried under Mechanicus refactoring. But the fact that they existed at all, that humans once had the courage to say no to Terra and chart their own stars, that's a story worth remembering. And maybe, just maybe, they're not all gone. There are occasional Vox scrambles from the edge of Segmentum Pacificus that don't match any known encryption. Ghost signals that repeat coordinates with no known origin. Dead worlds with underground facilities sealed tighter than any Mechanicus vault. Could one of these lost civilizations have survived in the deep dark, hiding through the millennia? If so, what would they think of us now? Would they see us as cousins, sad, broken echoes of what once was, or as enemies, enslaved by a corpse god and terrified of our own past? Either way, they remind us that humanity, at its core, is more than the Imperium. It was more once, and maybe, in some corner of the stars, it still is. One of the most fascinating and deeply unsettling chapters of the Dark Age of technology wasn't about machines or lost empires. It was about what humanity did to itself. The age wasn't just a time of expansion or scientific discovery. It was a time of transformation. At some point, we stopped merely adapting to our environments and started reshaping ourselves to dominate them. It wasn't enough to terraform worlds anymore. We terraformed people. And that, more than anything else, created some of the strangest and most forgotten civilizations in all of human history. The thing is, genetic modification back then wasn't seen as unnatural or taboo. It was practical, efficient, a sign of progress. You land on a high-radiation planet, you don't waste centuries waiting for protective architecture. You just alter your colonists, make their skin reflect gamma rays, modify their blood to resist mutation, adjust their vision for infrared. At first, these tweaks were minor, functional, targeted, temporary. But over time, whole populations began evolving away from baseline humanity, not through slow Darwinian drift, but through deliberate, directed engineering, and some of them didn't stop at adaptation. There are records, most of them wiped or inaccessible, of course, about entire civilizations that abandoned the idea of being human in the traditional sense. They embraced a new ideal, posthumanism. You see hints of it in Mechanicus folklore, stories of the Helix clans or the Vardari ascendants, people whose DNA was rewritten so radically they no longer resembled humans at all. Six-limbed miners for high-gravity planets, amphibious thinkers with dual brain structures for aquatic colonies, even creatures engineered for zero-gravity environments with ribbon-like musculature and lungs adapted for the thinnest traces of atmosphere. It's easy to romanticize all this as some kind of golden experimentation, but it wasn't all noble exploration. Some of these genetic civilizations crossed lines even by today's standards. There are scattered mentions of war castes bred solely for violence, creatures that couldn't not fight because their neurochemistry was hardwired to seek conflict. There were sensory-optimized ruling classes who could smell emotion or communicate in coded pheromones. Societies where you were bred into your function before birth, and where deviation wasn't just discouraged, it was literally impossible. One of the most controversial examples in fan circles is the so-called Epsilon strain, allegedly a human offshoot created for deep space recon missions. According to obscure lore fragments, these beings had no sense of individual identity. They shared thoughts across neural networks, acted in coordinated silence, and had lifespans measured in centuries. They weren't treated as abominations. They were celebrated. Until one day, their creators tried to shut them down, and the Epsilon simply disappeared into the void. Some say they're still out there, drifting between dead systems, watching us evolve into shadows of what they once were. And here's where it gets really uncomfortable. Some of these civilizations weren't wiped out by enemies or warp storms. They were purged by other humans. The moment they became too different, the fear set in. Genetic purity became a rallying cry. This wasn't just a war of ideologies. It was a war of definitions. What is human? At what point does engineered adaptation become something else entirely? The Imperium, of course, answered that question with fire and steel. But back then, it was far murkier. There's a theory I've always found chilling, that the Emperor's later obsession with gene seed purity, with codified organs and rigid gene templates, was a direct reaction to the horrors and wonders of this era. That he saw what happens when humanity evolves without limits, and decided it was better to chain it, better to stagnate than to splinter. And yet, part of me mourns what was lost. Not the monstrosities or the tyrants, but the possibility. What if one of those post-human societies had found a way to live in harmony, not just with themselves, but with others? What if diversity of form had become a strength instead of a threat? We'll never know. Most of their histories were erased, their genomes burned, their worlds turned to ash or absorbed into the grim machinery of the Imperium. Even now, there are rumors. Stories of deep system explorers who encounter strange human-like beings, taller, faster, biologically unique, living in forgotten habitats or abandoned arcologies. The Adeptus Mechanicus calls them mutants or abominations. The Inquisition calls them threats. But some of us, we call them echoes. Echoes of a time when humanity wasn't afraid to be something more. In the end, what we lost wasn't just genetic knowledge or physical potential. We lost our courage to change. We built gods from steel and angels from genes, and then we killed them all because they made us uncomfortable. That's the tragedy of posthumanity. Not that it failed, but that it frightened us enough to erase it completely. There's a kind of deep, aching grief that comes when you realize just how much we've forgotten. Not just names or events, not just timelines or ideologies, but understanding itself. The Dark Age of technology wasn't just an era of progress. It was a time when humanity wielded science with such mastery that the things they built now seem like magic. And I don't mean that poetically, I mean that literally. In the 41st millennium, the tech priests of Mars chant litanies and smear oils over machines they barely comprehend, praying that the spirits of the ancients won't be angered. Meanwhile, the tools they're servicing were once just tools. Practical, functional, entirely understood by those who made them. But now, they're relics of a language we no longer speak. Look at the black stone pylons of Cadia, or the ancient teleportation arrays buried under Terra itself. There are devices across the galaxy that function, that still hum with ancient energy, but no one knows how they work. They just do. And that's the most haunting part. We've become passengers in a car we can't steer, carried forward by the ghosts of our own forgotten brilliance. Take teleportation, for instance. The Imperium still uses it, mostly in the form of teleportariums aboard massive ships or in high-security fortresses. But those systems are few, delicate, and barely maintained. Now compare that to what we think existed during the Dark Age: galactic relay hubs, possibly even intergalactic jump stations. Not just ship-to-ship or ship-to-surface teleportation, but world-to-world, maybe even system-to-system, all done with seamless precision. There's an old Mechanicus fragment that mentions a thread-lined corridor stretching between the Sagittarius Arm and a cluster near Andromeda. And if that's true, we were once walking between galaxies like they were rooms in a palace. And then there's architecture, not the grimdark Gothic monoliths we see today, but flowing, impossible structures, curves where no load-bearing curve should be, spherical buildings that float mid-air, cities suspended inside massive atmospheric envelopes, drifting miles above a planet's surface. I remember reading a fan theory about the sphere of Chthonus, supposedly a mobile city station that orbited dying stars to harness their last pulses of energy, designed entirely using higher dimensional geometry. Some say that even looking at the design schematics causes mental strain unless you've been genetically or cybernetically altered to process multi-vector space. It's not even sci-fi at this point. It's borderline spiritual. We didn't just master engineering. We broke its rules and rewrote them. And what about code? Today's tech priests interface with machines using Binharik, this ritualized ancient language of ones and zeros and sacred syllables. But that's just the remnant. The systems from the Dark Age responded to dynamic logic trees, probabilistic predictive models, self-correcting recursive commands, systems so advanced that they evolved on their own, adapting to their users. There are databanks out there with encryption so complex that the Mechanicus has been trying to crack a single line for centuries. One theory I absolutely love, though it's borderline heresy, is that some of these codes aren't meant to be deciphered by individuals at all, but by collectives. Like you'd need a society of minds, connected in real time, all interpreting the signal simultaneously to make sense of it. And that's not even getting into the darker mysteries. There are reports of machines that defy causality, boxes that show the outcome of decisions before they're made, doors that only open when you stop thinking about them. A fan once pointed out that certain ancient Mechanicus reliquaries are surrounded by empty space, not because no one wants to go there, but because those who try never return, and no memory of their approach remains. Think about that. Tech so advanced it can erase your timeline like a chalkboard swipe. The worst part? We've built our empire on the ruins of these wonders. Entire forge worlds exist to manufacture copies of things their creators never fully understood. Standard template constructs, STCs, are treated like divine artifacts, but even those are just fragments. Most STCs today can't replicate what was common in the past. One of the more depressing Mechanicus quotes I came across said, "A complete STC is the dream. A tenth of one is a miracle. A single uncorrupted subroutine, that's a crusade." And you feel that desperation in everything they do, every prayer, every rite. It's all driven by this gnawing knowledge that we are lesser than those who came before. And sure, you could say this is all exaggeration, that maybe we're romanticizing the past too much. But then you see a piece of that lost tech in action, a functioning telepathic archive, a non-Newtonian blade, a planetary weather control satellite that still shifts atmospheres from orbit, and you realize, no, this was real. We didn't dream it, we did it, and then we forgot. I think that's what makes the Dark Age so mythic. It's not just about the tech, it's about the sheer loss, like watching someone burn a library of gods page by page and not even realizing what they're destroying. We didn't just fall from grace. We tumbled from a height we can't even comprehend anymore. And now we're crawling through the ruins, worshipping the scraps. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough when people romanticize the Dark Age of technology, just how often humanity went to war with itself. We like to imagine it as a golden era, a time of peace and boundless progress. But dig a little deeper and you find something darker festering underneath all that brilliance. Even at the peak of our power, we couldn't stop fighting each other. Maybe it was inevitable. Maybe once we spread across the stars and lost any central authority worth a damn, conflict was just a matter of time. And when it came, it didn't look anything like the wars we know now. It was bigger, stranger, more devastating than anything we could wrap our heads around. This was before the Emperor, before the unification of Terra. Back when Earth itself was just one voice among thousands, and not even the loudest one. Humanity had scattered like stardust, colonizing every rock that could support life and quite a few that couldn't. Entire civilizations rose in isolation, grew confident, developed new cultures, ideologies, technologies, and eventually started eyeing each other with suspicion. One post-human society might look at another and see only a threat. They didn't speak the same language, didn't think the same way, sometimes didn't even breathe the same air. Unity was a dream. Paranoia was the reality. And when war broke out, it wasn't some skirmish over a trade route. These were galaxy-shaking conflicts. There are whispers about the solar rebellions, where outer system colonies tried to blockade the Terran core and starve Earth into submission. About the fall of Vardaxis, a hub of hyper-intelligent clones who declared themselves a new evolutionary step, and were eradicated by neighboring systems in a coordinated strike that turned their sun into a dead husk. Some fan circles believe that the death of whole subsectors, now labeled as forbidden zones or warp-blasted wastelands, were caused not by Xenos or demons, but by these ancient civil wars. Humanity, at its height, had the power to level entire stars, and apparently, it did. We talk about exterminatus today like it's the ultimate punishment. Back then, it was just a tactic, flooding a biosphere with molecular disassemblers. Standard, weaponizing black holes, experimental but not unheard of. There's even mention of logic plagues, cognitive viruses transmitted via data packets that could crash entire planetary networks, drive AIs insane, and even psychologically destabilize populations. Imagine fighting an enemy who doesn't just bomb your cities, but erases your history, fractures your reality, makes your people forget who they are. That's what war looked like at the apex of human capability. And it wasn't just the tools, it was the reasons. Some of the causes seem so petty now. Cultural disputes, religious schisms, competition over rare materials or lost STC fragments. Entire civilizations wiped out because someone didn't want to share a teleportation protocol. But beneath that, I think there was something deeper. A fear that the other side had found a better way to be human. That fear, that existential anxiety, drove us to madness. One of the most debated cases is the Helios Accord, which was supposed to be a diplomatic unification of several major human powers. Instead, it collapsed into the so-called 7-Hour War, a conflict so intense and so short that it broke the galactic relay network in that region, stranding entire sectors without communication for centuries. Even the Mechanicus has fragments of sensor data showing mass deletions of orbital infrastructures, like someone just drew a line through a star map and everything along it disappeared. That's not just war, that's self-immolation on a civilizational scale. And the irony is, many of these conflicts happened in the name of peace. Defensive alliances, preemptive strikes, ensuring the survival of one's people at the cost of others. Sound familiar? That's the Imperium's entire playbook. Maybe we didn't fall from grace. Maybe we've always been this way. Brilliant, afraid, and ultimately doomed to turn our greatest achievements into weapons. I think that's why the Adeptus Terra buries this part of our past so deeply. Because if the truth got out, if people really understood how much of our suffering we brought on ourselves, it would shatter the myth of humanity as the noble torchbearer in a dark galaxy. We were never unified. We were never righteous. We were a million sparks flaring in the void, and when those sparks met, they burned each other out. Some say that's what finally broke the back of the Golden Age, not the Men of Iron, not warp storms, but us. Our refusal to coexist, our hunger to dominate. By the time the Age of Strife began, the damage was already done. The alliances were broken, the archives were lost, and the ruins of entire empires were left smoldering on dead worlds. We always talk about how the Emperor had to save humanity. But no one ever asks, save it from what? The answer's terrifying in its simplicity, from itself. Of all the ruins and remnants scattered across the galaxy, it's the ones we can't find that haunt me the most. Not the derelict ships or rusted forges, not even the silent arcologies buried under kilometers of ash. No, the ones that really get under your skin are the missing worlds. The legends, the whispers of planets that once held something truly other, something we haven't seen since. Places that don't just seem lost, but deliberately hidden, as if the galaxy itself conspired to bury them. And yet, stories still leak through the cracks. Stories of utopias, of experimental societies, of perfect worlds that vanished without a trace. Take Ilara's Veil, one of the more persistent legends in Mechanicus rumor networks. Supposedly, it was a world flower, a term we don't even fully understand anymore. The idea was that the planet had been sculpted into layers of biotechnological harmony. No pollution, no war, just an artificial ecosystem tuned so perfectly that even weather followed an aesthetic design. Trees that produced oxygen tuned to enhance human neural clarity. Rivers with nanite filtration so pure they could reverse cellular aging. There's one recovered line from a lost data vault that reads, "Even the shadows in Ilara's Veil were curated to be beautiful." And yet, no one knows where it was. Some say it was destroyed during the Men of Iron uprising. Others claim it phased itself out of normal space, gone but not destroyed. Then there's the Obsidian Ring. That one always gives me chills. It's not a planet, but a structure, or was. Theories describe it as a megastructure orbiting a neutron star, made entirely of reflective, non-spectral alloys. It supposedly housed a post-human collective that uploaded their consciousnesses into quantum lattices and lived in a simulated universe of their own making. No war, no death, just endless evolution of thought. Some speculate that their physical forms dissolved into stasis chambers over centuries, until the only thing left was data, dreaming itself into infinity. And then one day, the ring went dark, completely. Not destroyed, just silent. Nothing in, nothing out. No radiation, no energy signatures, as if it folded up and left reality behind. Another that always gets brought up in fan circles is the Trinary worlds. 3 sister planets arranged in a perfect equilateral triangle orbit, sharing a synchronized ecosystem. Each world was designed for a specific phase of human experience: creation, existence, and conclusion. One planet for birth and education, one for life and labor, and one for rest, reflection, and eventual death. Not in a morbid sense, but as part of a philosophical cycle. They called it the human arc. Of course, there's no surviving map that includes the Trinary worlds. Just sketches in marginalia, half references in corrupted STC files, or warped nursery rhymes found in derelict habitats. One theory claims the Mechanicus found one of the three and sealed it off entirely because it still works, because it's too perfect, a reminder of what we lost. And then there are the real strange ones, planets that don't seem to obey natural laws, worlds where gravity folds inward, where time runs differently near the poles, or where entire cities remain untouched while their inhabitants turn to dust in an instant. The kinds of places that make even the Inquisition hesitate. Some call them echo worlds. Others say they're the remnants of failed experiments, artificial realms created by ancient humans trying to push the boundaries of dimensional physics or warp manipulation without knowing the cost. One fragment from a rogue data recovery unit claims, "We built paradise into a loop, and now it repeats itself forever, never noticing we've left." It's creepy stuff. You start to see a pattern after a while. These aren't just stories about cool old tech or lost cities. They're warnings, coded, accidental or otherwise. All these perfect worlds, all these utopias, none of them lasted. Something always went wrong. Maybe it was arrogance, maybe it was sabotage, or maybe paradise just isn't meant to exist in a universe like ours. Still, the hope lingers. Every time an explorer ship disappears beyond the halo stars, or a half-corrupted data crystal gets pulled from the ruins of a pre-Imperial vault, we wonder, what if? What if one of those forgotten worlds is still out there, untouched by the madness of the Imperium, the ruin of chaos, or the hunger of Xenos? A place where humanity's potential didn't die screaming, but simply stepped out of the spotlight. Of course, the official line is that these stories are apocryphal, tech heresy, fabrications made to undermine faith in the Imperium. But when you talk to old voidfarers, explorators who've seen things the cog priests won't write down, you start hearing the same phrases repeated, the same names, the same coordinates, just scrambled enough to be deniable. And they always say the same thing at the end. It's still out there. We just haven't earned the right to find it again. Maybe they're right. Or maybe these are just ghost stories we tell ourselves to ease the ache of a galaxy grown cold and cruel. But deep down, I want to believe that somewhere out there, a piece of our better self survived. And it's waiting, for all its brilliance, for all its staggering technological marvels and towering utopian experiments. The dark age of technology was never a safe haven. The galaxy was never empty. And the moment humanity spread its wings across the stars, it started brushing up against things it didn't understand, things it couldn't always dominate. Contact with alien life wasn't rare in those days. It was practically inevitable, and not all of it was hostile. But it didn't need to be. Sometimes the mere idea of something truly other was enough to cause panic, jealousy, or cultural collapse. Sometimes just seeing how differently life could be was enough to crack a civilization in half. There are scattered records, corrupted logs, half-burnt expedition files about human colonies entering into trade agreements with Xenos species, peaceful, even productive relationships, mutual advancement. One infamous example is the All-Bite Convergence, supposedly a ring of human worlds that shared knowledge with a race known only as the Lithek. The Lithek are gone now, naturally. No trace, no bones, not even their language remains. All we have are vague descriptions, shimmering, translucent, hyper-empathetic beings who communicated through color and emotion. And the humans who traded with them. They changed, not just in technology, but in mindset. Entire generations born after the Alliance developed new modes of perception, new ways of thinking. And when they tried to reintegrate with wider humanity, it didn't go well. They were called mutants, heretics. They were purged, not for fighting humanity, but for no longer fitting into it. That's a pattern that repeats more often than you'd think. Cultures touched by the truly alien come back. Off. Not evil, not corrupted, just different. And in a galaxy that worships sameness, different is deadly. Some believe that the fear of Xenos influence in the modern Imperium stems directly from this era, not because aliens were always enemies, but because they made us question what we were, and that, perhaps, was a greater threat than any war fleet or biomass swarm. But you don't need aliens to lose yourself. Sometimes the rot comes from within. And oh, did it come. There were civilizations during the Dark Age that pursued progress so far. They started engineering emotion, artificial joy, programmable purpose. Entire populations altered to remove sadness, guilt, or fear. Chemical balances rewritten, pleasure centers optimized. At first, it must have felt like utopia. Imagine a world where no one ever feels regret. But then, you realize what that means. No empathy, no accountability, no capacity to process consequences. These societies began drifting into cold utilitarianism, justice systems without compassion, education without questioning. And when something went wrong, because something always goes wrong, there was no framework left to deal with it. Just logical responses, clinical solutions. Sometimes that meant mass euthanasia. Other times, sterilization, in the name of optimization. And then there were the machine cults. Not the Adeptus Mechanicus, not yet. I'm talking about the pre-imperial techno-faiths that began to treat artificial intelligence not just as a tool or a partner, but as an object of worship. Some went full synthetic, uploaded their consciousness into data clusters, believing that the body was a prison. Others created recursive thinking loops, digital gods that fed off belief in themselves and grew more powerful the more followers they gained. At least one civilization, according to what little data we have, managed to trap itself in a simulation they couldn't escape. Not because they were imprisoned, but because they refused to leave. They preferred the illusion to the messy, unpredictable truth of the real galaxy. Their worlds went silent, empty shells in orbit, cities intact, but no minds left to inhabit them. Ethical breakdowns became more and more common. Without a unified moral framework, some human civilizations decided to rewrite their own rules from scratch. One built a society where individuality was a sickness, where the ultimate virtue was self-erasure into a collective stream. Another engineered castes so specialized that communication between them required ritual translators, because their brains were no longer wired to understand each other. Some of these experiments ended quickly. Others dragged on for centuries before collapsing under the weight of their own contradictions. And all of this, contact with aliens, moral drift, cultural splintering, it left a mark, a fear. You can feel it in every aspect of the Imperium's modern design. The xenophobia, the obsession with purity, the hatred of deviation. It's not just religious dogma, it's trauma. Institutionalized, weaponized trauma from a time when humanity tried to go too far in too many directions and nearly broke itself in the process. I think the most tragic part is that not all of these paths were doomed. Some of them might have worked, given more time, more understanding, more willingness to adapt. But that wasn't the world we lived in, not then, and certainly not now. Instead of learning from the missteps, the Imperium burned it all down and built a fortress from the ashes. But the echoes are still there. Hidden worlds, forbidden archives, strange anomalies. Every now and then, someone uncovers a sliver of what once was, a relic, a genetic record, a machine that speaks in a forgotten tongue, and it reminds us of how far we fell, of what we became afraid to be, and of what perhaps we could have been. It's hard not to take it personally, you know? The way the Imperium treats knowledge, real knowledge, deep knowledge, as if it's a loaded gun aimed at its own head. Sometimes it feels like we're living in the ruins of a dream, and instead of trying to rebuild it, the High Lords decided the safest thing was to burn every blueprint, smash every archive, and make sure no one ever dreamed that big again. It's easy to look at the Imperium's fanaticism and call it superstition, but beneath all the incense smoke and servo skulls, there's a deliberate pattern. The Imperium chooses ignorance, It enforces it, because deep down, it knows that truth is dangerous. Especially that truth, the one that says we were better once. The Emperor himself may have started this cycle, or at least allowed it to happen. During the Great Crusade, he claimed to be bringing enlightenment, but his actions spoke differently. Entire planets were sterilized for clinging to forbidden technologies, even when those technologies were helping them survive. Civilizations that had rebuilt pieces of the Dark Age were shattered not because they posed a threat, but because they remembered. Because they dared to preserve something the Imperium couldn't control. It's like they weren't destroyed for being heretical, but for being inconvenient reminders of everything the Imperium could never be. There's a quote attributed to a forgotten Magos buried in a noospheric transmission. To build upon the ashes of gods, one must first ensure no altar remains. That's what it feels like. A purge not just of relics and records, but of identity. A conscious erasure of humanity's brightest age, because acknowledging it would make the current order look small and frightened in comparison. The Imperium thrives on the myth that it is the pinnacle of human achievement. The moment someone sees through that myth, the whole thing begins to wobble. And yet, not everything is gone. Some knowledge did survive, buried deep under layers of ritual and dogma. The Adeptus Mechanicus, bless their twisted paranoid hearts, are hoarders of the highest order. They claim to worship the machine god, but really, they worship the past. Every scrap of STC code, every data-etched cog, every half-corrupted schematic is a holy relic to them. And while they pretend it's all too sacred to be used, the truth is more complicated. They're still experimenting, quietly, carefully. On distant Forge worlds, far from the eyes of the Inquisition, there are vaults where ancient constructs walk again. Prototype weapons test-fired against asteroid targets. Auto-factories that hum with secrets long thought dead. Some magi believe that the Omnissiah isn't the Emperor, but the idea of perfection that humanity once embodied. And they're searching for it, not in prayer, but in code. In the locked chambers of Mars, it's said there are databanks that speak in languages no one understands, not because they're Xenos, but because they're ours, just too far ahead for anyone left to parse. There are vaults sealed not by force, but by ignorance. We've lost the keys, and the Mechanicus fears what might happen if we ever find them again. But not all remnants are in Mechanicus' hands. Out in the void, on the edges of the Imperium where administratum oversight gets thin and reality starts to fray, there are worlds where fragments of the old knowledge still cling to life. Dead planets with AI cores that still flicker in the dark. Hollow moons where post-human entities sleep in stasis. Derelict ships drifting between stars, their databanks untouched, still looping emergency broadcasts in languages that haven't been spoken in 10,000 years. Some rogue traders make their entire careers chasing these ghosts, and a few even return. Changed. Richer, maybe. Wiser. Or mad. Because the truth, when it's raw and unfiltered, doesn't just fill gaps in your understanding, it reshapes you. Even among Inquisitors, there are whispers. Radicals who believe that the future of humanity depends on reclaiming what was lost. They call it the Arcanotech heresy. Others call it salvation. These are the ones who raid Mechanicus archives, infiltrate sealed vaults, decode forbidden scripts not to destroy them, but to learn. They're rare. They don't last long, but they exist, and their work keeps that fragile ember of curiosity alive. What scares the Imperium more than any alien or demon is the idea that we could become something else, something more, that we could break the chains of tradition, the weight of dogma, and look the stars in the eye again without fear. Because if we did that, if we remembered what we truly are, the Imperium as we know it wouldn't survive. It would be obsolete. So they keep burning books, sealing vaults, rewriting history with every passing century. But knowledge is stubborn. It doesn't stay buried forever. And every now and then, someone stumbles onto a forgotten world, a forbidden archive, or a machine that shouldn't exist, and for just a moment they remember. They see the shape of what was, what could be, and for all the fear and fire the Imperium throws at that moment, it never truly dies. Because the truth has a gravity of its own, and sooner or later, it pulls someone in. Sometimes when I think about the dark age of technology, what it meant, what we lost, I get this strange feeling, like standing at the edge of a cliff and staring down into fog. You know there's something massive beneath you, something ancient and powerful, but no matter how hard you try, you'll never quite see it. You'll never touch it. All you get are shadows, stories, the faintest vibrations in the stone. That's what our past has become. Not history, but myth. Not memory, but silence. And it hurts, doesn't it? To know we were once more than this. That there were worlds brighter than any hive spire, cities more alive than anything the Imperium has built in 10,000 years. People who dreamed beyond survival, who reached for something beautiful, and sometimes even caught it. And now, all we have are ruins and rules, holy machines we can't fix, data vaults we're forbidden to open. It's like we've built our entire civilization on a grave, and the headstone's been scratched clean. But still, I don't think all is lost. Not entirely. There are moments, rare, fleeting, where you feel that spark. When an explorator finds a working fragment of a true STC, when a lost world turns out to be a preserved archive instead of a tomb, when someone, somewhere, dares to ask a forbidden question and actually finds an answer. Those moments remind me that humanity hasn't completely forgotten who we were. We've just been trained to be afraid of it, and maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that we lost our past, but that we taught ourselves to fear finding it again. Because what if we did recover that knowledge? What if we found the blueprints for teleportation networks, or the consciousness streaming towers, or the code languages that could rewrite reality itself? What would the Imperium do? Would it embrace the miracle? Or would it call it heresy and burn it, just like it always does? Some fans believe there are sleeper vaults, legacy systems from the Golden Age that are programmed to activate when certain conditions are met. A spike in warp anomalies, a collapse of critical star lanes, a bloodline reaching a specific genetic threshold. It sounds far-fetched, but then again, so does most of Warhammer 40K. Others think there are still functioning post-human enclaves hiding in the void, waiting for the Imperium to die, watching from the shadows with quiet patience. I don't know if I believe that, but I want to, because the truth is, the galaxy doesn't belong to the Imperium. It belongs to all of humanity, past, present, and whatever fragile future we might still scrape together. And the more we forget our beginnings, the more we shrink, the less we become. I look at a world like Terra and wonder what it would be if it still remembered. Not just the Emperor or the Great Crusade, but the real old days, when people walked among the stars without fear, when intelligence wasn't chained by superstition, when curiosity wasn't a crime. I don't expect the Imperium to change. Not tomorrow, maybe not ever. But I think it matters that we remember, that we talk about these things, even in whispers, that we share the legends of the lost worlds, the forbidden archives, the vanished peoples who once dared to shape the stars themselves. Because every time we tell those stories, we light a small flame against the darkness. And maybe one day, enough of those flames will burn bright enough to show us a way forward. So if you've made it this far, thank you. Thanks for sticking with me through all the speculation, the theory crafting, the what-ifs and maybe-nots. This isn't just lore to me. It's something deeper. A longing for what could have been. A love for the broken, beautiful, terrifying thing we call humanity in the 41st millennium. And if you want more dives like this, more forgotten history, more lost potential, more strange corners of the Warhammer universe that most people don't talk about, then hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone else who gets it. Someone who looks at a ruined machine and doesn't just see rust, but remembers that once it sang. The stars are wide, and there's still so much we don't know. But that's what makes this journey worth taking. So let's keep digging. Let's keep remembering. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find something they tried to make us forget.